The shackles around her wrists had worn grooves into her skin, and the smell of unwashed bodies and despair clung to the cargo hold like a second atmosphere. Elena Rose Martinez pressed her face against the rough wooden planks of the ship's hull, listening to the Atlantic waves crash against the vessel that carried her toward an unknown fate. 3 weeks at sea, 3 weeks since her father had signed the papers that transferred ownership of his debts and his daughter to a man she'd never met. 3 weeks since she'd learned that love could be bought and sold like livestock at market. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Virginia Territory, March 1858. The morning that changed everything had started like any other in the Martinez household. Elena woke before dawn to tend the small vegetable garden behind their modest cottage, her hands already rough from years of working soil that seemed to grow more stubborn with each passing season. At 19, she possessed the kind of quiet, beauty that drew second glances in church, dark hair that caught sunlight like spun silk, eyes the color of rich coffee, and a grace born from years of making do with less than enough. Their small farm outside Richmond had been her grandfather's pride, 40 acres of Virginia soil that had supported 3 generations of the Martinez family. But that was before the debts began mounting, before the failed harvests, before her. Father Miguel's drinking had transformed from an occasional escape into a daily necessity that consumed what little money they managed to scrape together. Elena had watched their circumstances deteriorate with the helpless clarity of someone old enough to understand the implications, but too young to have any power over them. First, they'd sold the livestock, the milk cow that had been like a family, Pet, the chickens that had provided their breakfast eggs, the old plough horse that Miguel had taught Elena to ride when she was 7. Then came the furniture, piece by piece, until their home contained little more than beds, a kitchen table, and the rocking chair where Eleanor's mother used to sit before consumption had claimed her 5 years earlier. The debt collector had been circling their property for months, like a vulture sensing carrion. Bartholomew Ashford was a man who dealt in human misery, as if it were just another commodity to be bought, sold, and traded for profit. He owned textile mills throughout Virginia and South Carolina, operations that required a constant supply of workers willing to labor for wages that barely covered the cost of company housing and meals. When traditional employees proved too expensive or too difficult to manage, Ashford had developed more creative solutions to his labor needs. Miguel Martinez owed Ashford nearly $300, a sum that might as well have been $3,000 for all the hope they had of repaying it. The debt had accumulated over 2 years of failed crops, medical bills from Elena's mother's final illness, and Miguel's increasingly desperate attempts to drink away the guilt of watching his family's legacy crumble in his hands. On this particular March morning, Elena was hanging laundry on the line behind their cottage when she heard horses approaching on the main road. She paused, a damp sheet clutched in her hands, and watched 3 riders turn into their lane. She recognized Ashford immediately. His expensive black coat and silver-headed walking stick made him unmistakable even at a distance. The 2 men flanking him looked like hired muscle, the kind of men who settled disputes with their fists rather than their words. Miguel appeared from the cottage, his movements unsteady despite the early hour. Elena could smell the whiskey on him from 20 paces away, could see the tremor in his hands as he attempted to straighten his shoulders and face whatever news these men brought. "Miguel Martinez!" Ashford called out as he dismounted, his voice carrying the cultured accent of old Virginia money. "I trust you know why I'm here." "I told you I needed more time," Miguel replied, his words slightly slurred. The spring planting will fail just like the last 2 years' crops," Ashford interrupted, brushing invisible dust from his coat sleeves. Your credit is exhausted, Martinez. Your excuses have grown tiresome. Payment is due today, in full. Elena dropped the sheet she'd been holding and moved closer to the conversation, her heart beginning to race as she recognized the finality in Ashford's tone. She'd heard this conversation before in different variations, but today something felt different. Today felt like an ending. "I don't have $300, Miguel said, his voice breaking slightly. "You know I don't have it. If you take the farm, we'll have nothing. Elena will have nowhere to go." Ashford's gaze shifted to Elena for the first time, his pale blue eyes conducting an assessment that made her skin crawl. She was suddenly aware of how her work dress clung to her figure, how the morning light caught the highlights in her hair. She wanted to retreat to the cottage, to disappear from this man's calculating stare, but something kept her rooted in place. "Perhaps," Ashford said slowly, "we can arrange an alternative form of payment." The words hung in the air like a physical threat. Elena saw her father's face drain of color as the implication became clear. Miguel took a step backward, shaking his head. "No," he whispered, "not Elena. She's all I have left. She's 19 years old, healthy, educated enough to read and write." Ashford continued as if Miguel hadn't spoken. "I have business interests in South Carolina that require domestic staff. Your daughter could work off your debt in my household there. 7 years of service, and we'll call your obligations satisfied." Elena felt the ground shifting beneath her feet, her understanding of her own future realigning in real time. 7 years. She would be 26 when her servitude ended, assuming Ashford honored the agreement. By then, any chance of a normal life, marriage, children, a home of her own, would have passed her by. "What kind of domestic service?" Miguel asked, though Elena could see in his eyes that he already suspected the answer. "Whatever services my household requires," Ashford replied with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Cleaning, cooking, tending to guests. She'll be housed and fed, of course. It's quite generous, actually. Most indentured servants don't have their terms so clearly defined." Indentured servant. The words tasted like ashes in Elena's mouth. In 1858, such arrangements were technically legal, though they existed in the grey area between employment and slavery. A woman bound by indenture had no legal rights, no recourse. If her master proved cruel or demanding, no protection beyond whatever conscience her owner possessed. "Papa, no," Elena said, finding her voice for the first time. "We'll find another way. We can sell the land, move somewhere else." "The land is already mine," Ashford interrupted. "Your father used it as collateral for his drinking debt 6 months ago. The only question now is whether you come with me willingly, or whether I involve the sheriff and make this more unpleasant for everyone involved." Miguel seemed to age 10 years in the space of a heartbeat. His shoulders sagged as the full weight of what he'd done crashed down on him. He'd gambled away not just his farm, but his daughter's freedom, and now there was no path back from the choices he'd made. "How do I know you'll treat her well?" Miguel asked, his voice barely audible. "You don't," Ashford replied honestly. "But you also don't have any other options. The carriage leaves for Charleston this afternoon. Your daughter can pack 1 bag with personal items. Everything else stays here." Elena stared at her father, waiting for him to refuse, to fight, to find some alternative that didn't involve selling his only child to pay for his mistakes. But Miguel couldn't meet her eyes, couldn't summon the courage to face what his weakness had cost them both. "I need time to think," Elena said, her mind racing through possibilities that all seemed to lead to the same terrible conclusion. "You have until noon," Ashford said, mounting his horse with the casual authority of a man accustomed to having his commands obeyed. "After that, the terms change, and they won't be as favorable." As the 3 riders disappeared down the lane, Elena and her father stood in silence, the morning sunshine suddenly feeling cold against their skin. The laundry she'd been hanging, fluttered in the breeze like surrender flags, and somewhere in the distance a church bell chimed the hour. 4 hours. Elena had 4 hours to decide whether to sacrifice herself for her father's debts or watch him face whatever consequences Ashford might devise. 4 hours to prepare for a journey that would take her hundreds of miles from everything familiar into the household of a man whose idea of appropriate domestic service remained ominously undefined. "Elena," Miguel said finally, his voice thick with shame and unshed tears. "I'm sorry, I'm so sorry." But apologies, Elena realized, were worthless currency when measured against the price of freedom. And as she walked toward the cottage to pack the single bag that would contain her entire life, she wondered if she would ever see Virginia again, or if this March morning marked the end of Elena Martinez and the beginning of something else entirely. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the yard as Elena stood beside Ashford's carriage, her small leather satchel clutched in her hands. Inside were her mother's rosary, a few letters from her childhood friend who'd moved to Baltimore, and the blue dress she'd worn to her mother's funeral, the only nice dress she owned. Everything else, her books, her mother's china, the sampler she'd embroidered as a child, would remain behind, artifacts of a life that was already beginning to feel like someone else's memory. Miguel stood beside her, swaying slightly despite his efforts to appear sober for their farewell. His eyes were red-rimmed, whether from drink or tears. Elena couldn't tell. Perhaps both. "Write to me," he said, pressing a small cloth bundle into her hands. "When you can." Elena unwrapped the bundle and found $5 silver, probably the last money he had in the world. She wanted to refuse it, to tell him he needed it more than she did, but something in his expression stopped her. Giving her this money was perhaps the only parental act he could still perform, the only way he could demonstrate that some part of him still cared about her welfare. "I will, Papa," she promised, though they both knew that letters between an indentured servant and her family were subject to her master's approval. There was no guarantee that Ashford would permit such communication. The carriage door opened, and Ashford's voice cut through their goodbye. "Time to leave, Miss Martinez. We have a ship to catch." Elena kissed her father's cheek, tasting salt and whiskey, then climbed into the carriage without looking back. As they pulled away from the cottage, she pressed her face to the window and watched her childhood disappear into the dust kicked up by the wheels. The journey to Charleston took 3 days by carriage, then another 3 weeks by ship to reach their final destination. Elena spent the voyage in the cargo hold with a dozen other women whose circumstances varied, but whose destination remained the same: the Ashford plantation outside Charleston, where they would work off debts, court judgments, or family obligations, under terms that none of them had been allowed to negotiate. During those long days at sea, Eleanor learned that Ashford's definition of domestic service encompassed a wide range of duties. Some women would work in the textile mill he operated, on the plantation grounds. Others would serve in his main house, cleaning and cooking and tending to the needs of his family and guests. A few, the youngest and prettiest, would serve in capacities that were never explicitly defined but were understood by everyone to involve more than household chores. Elena also learned that Ashford had a son, Marcus, who was said to be nothing like his father. The other women spoke of him in whispers, describing a young man who disapproved of his father's business practices but seemed powerless to change them. Some claimed he'd helped servants escape in the past, though others dismissed such stories as wishful thinking designed to make their circumstances seem less hopeless. As the ship approached Charleston Harbor, Elena stood on deck and watched the South Carolina coastline emerge from the morning mist. Somewhere beyond that shoreline lay her future. 7 years of servitude to a man whose cruelty was already legendary among the women who'd preceded her. But Elena Martinez had not survived. 19 years of poverty and hardship by accepting defeat easily. As she watched the harbour grow larger, she made herself a promise. She would endure whatever Ashford demanded of her, but she would not be broken by it. She would find a way to survive, to maintain her dignity, and eventually to reclaim her freedom. What she couldn't have imagined, as she prepared to disembark into her new life of bondage, was that her salvation would come not from her own efforts, but from the unexpected kindness of the one person who had the power to set her free. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Charleston, South Carolina, April 1858. The Ashford plantation sprawled across 2,000 acres of South Carolina lowland like a carefully orchestrated display of wealth and power. Spanish moss draped the ancient oak trees that lined the main drive, creating a canopy so thick it filtered the afternoon sunlight into cathedral-like beams that danced across the crushed shell road. Elena pressed her face to the carriage window, taking in her first glimpse of what would be her prison for the next 7 years. The main house rose from a manicured lawn like something from a fever dream, 3 stories of white-columned grandeur that spoke of generations of wealth built on the backs of others' labor. Wide verandas wrapped around each level, furnished with rocking chairs and hanging baskets that suggested leisurely afternoons spent in comfortable contemplation. It was beautiful in the way that power often was, impressive, intimidating, and completely indifferent to the suffering required to maintain it. But Elena's destination wasn't the main house. As the carriage continued past the grand entrance, she could see the true heart of Ashford's empire spreading out behind the facade of southern gentility. Row upon row of worker housing stretched toward the horizon, small, identical cabins that housed the mill workers and domestic staff. Beyond that, the textile mill itself dominated the landscape, its massive brick structure topped with smokestacks that belched dark clouds into the pristine blue sky. The carriage finally stopped in front of a modest 2-story building that looked like a cross between a boarding house and a military barracks. A severe-looking woman in her 50s emerged from the front door, her grey hair pulled back so tightly it seemed to stretch the skin around her temples. She wore a simple black dress with a white apron, and her expression suggested that smiling was a luxury she'd long since abandoned. "Miss Martinez," Ashford said as he helped Elena down from the carriage, his grip on her arm just firm enough to remind her of her changed circumstances. "This is Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, my head of domestic staff. She'll explain your duties and living arrangements." Mrs. Hartwell looked Elena up and down with the practiced eye of someone who'd assessed hundreds of new arrivals, cataloguing strengths and weaknesses, potential usefulness, and likely problems. Her gaze lingered on Elena's face, taking note of her youth and the kind of beauty that could complicate household dynamics. "Follow me," Mrs. Hartwell said without preamble, her voice carrying the crisp authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Mr. Ashford doesn't tolerate tardiness or confusion about expectations." Elena retrieved her small satchel from the carriage and followed Mrs. Hartwell into the building, casting one last glance at Ashford as he remounted his horse. He was already turning his attention to other matters, their transaction complete from his perspective. She was now just another piece of property to be managed by his staff. The interior of the domestic quarters was functional rather than comfortable. A narrow hallway ran the length of the building, with doors opening onto small rooms that housed 2 women each. The walls were bare wood, painted white, but showing signs of wear and age. The smell of lye soap and boiled cabbage hung in the air, underlaid with the musty scent of too many people living in too small a space. "This will be your room," Mrs. Hartwell said, opening a door near the far end of the hall. "You'll share with Rebecca Stone. She's worked here for 3 years and knows the routines. Listen to her, follow her example, and you might survive your term without incident. The room contained 2 narrow beds, a shared washstand, and a single window that looked out toward the mill complex. Elena's roommate was nowhere to be seen, probably still working her afternoon shift in whatever capacity she served. Meals are at 6 in the morning, noon, and 6 in the evening, Mrs. Hartwell continued, her tone suggesting she wouldn't repeat this information. You'll be assigned work details tomorrow morning after Mr. Ashford has decided how best to utilize your particular qualities. Tonight, you'll observe the evening service in the main house to understand what will be expected of you. Elena nodded, setting her satchel on the bed closer to the window. The mattress was thin and the blanket rough, but it was better than the ship's cargo hold where she'd spent the last 3 weeks. One more thing, Mrs. Hartwell said, pausing in the doorway. Mr. Ashford runs a proper household, and he expects proper behavior from his staff. Misconduct of any kind, laziness, insubordination, inappropriate fraternization, is dealt with, swiftly and severely. The terms of your indenture give him considerable latitude in how he manages discipline. The warning was clear enough. Elena was property now, subject to whatever punishments Ashford deemed appropriate for any perceived infractions. She had no legal recourse, no protection beyond whatever mercy her master chose to show. As Mrs. Hartwell's footsteps receded down the hallway, Eleanor sank onto her assigned bed and allowed herself a moment of despair. The reality of her situation was settling in with crushing weight. 7 years in this place, serving at the whim of a man who'd already demonstrated his willingness to trade in human lives like livestock. But the moment of weakness passed quickly. Elena had learned early in life that self-pity was a luxury that poor people couldn't afford. She stood, smoothed her skirts, and began unpacking her few belongings. If she was going to survive this place, she needed to understand its rules, its rhythms, and its dangers. The door opened just as she was placing her mother's rosary on the small shelf beside her bed. A young woman entered, her brown hair escaping from a hastily pinned bun and her apron stained with what looked like kitchen grease. "You must be the new girl," the woman said, offering a tired but genuine smile. "I'm Rebecca Stone. Sorry I wasn't here when you arrived. Mrs. Hartwell had me scrubbing pots in the main house kitchen all afternoon." Rebecca was perhaps 25, with the kind of worn prettiness that suggested she'd once been beautiful, before exhaustion and hard work had dulled her edges. But her eyes were kind, and Elena sensed in her the possibility of friendship, or at least alliance. "Elena Martinez," she replied. "Mrs. Hartwell said you'd help me understand how things work here." Rebecca laughed, but there was no humor in it. Things work however Mr. Ashford says they work, and his moods change like coastal weather. One day he's all southern gentleman, tipping his hat and asking about your health. The next day he's screaming at someone for using too much soap or taking too long to serve his dinner. Elena settled onto her bed, grateful for the opportunity to learn from someone who'd survived this place for 3 years. "What kind of work will I be doing?" "Depends," Rebecca said, beginning to change out of her stained apron. "You're young and pretty, so you'll probably start as a house servant. Could be kitchen work, could be cleaning, could be serving at table when he has guests." She paused, giving Elena a meaningful look. "Could be other things, if you're not careful." The implication was clear, and Elena felt her stomach tighten. She'd heard whispers during the voyage about Ashford's expectations for his female servants, but she'd hoped they were exaggerated. "How not careful?" Eleanor asked. Rebecca sat on her own bed, her expression serious. "Ashford likes to play the benevolent master when it suits him. He'll single out girls he finds attractive, give them special assignments, lighter work, better food, makes them think they're special, that they've found a way to make their situation easier. She shook her head. But there's always a price, always expectations that go beyond household duties. Elena absorbed this information, filing it away with the other survival knowledge she was accumulating. And if someone refuses those expectations? Punishment duty, extra work shifts, reduced food rations, sometimes worse. I've seen girls sent to work in the mill for rejecting Ashford's advances. Mill work will break you in 6 months. The heat, the noise, the lint that gets in your lungs and never comes out. The conversation was interrupted by a bell ringing somewhere in the building. Rebecca immediately stood and began smoothing her hair and retying her apron. "Evening service," she explained. "Main house staff reports for dinner preparation and service. You'll come with me tonight to observe, then tomorrow you'll start your regular assignments." Elena followed Rebecca out of the building and across the grounds toward the main house. The sun was setting behind the oak trees, painting the white. Columns in shades of gold and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. As they walked, Rebecca pointed out various buildings and landmarks: the kitchen garden where some of the women worked, the laundry facility where others spent their days, the overseer's house where discipline was administered. "That's the mill." "Supervisor's house," Rebecca said, indicating a modest but well-maintained cottage near the mill complex. "Thomas Crawford runs the mill operations. He's fair enough, but he answers to Ashford like everyone else." "And that?" Elena asked, pointing to a smaller house set apart from the others, surrounded by its own garden and positioned to overlook both the main house and the mill. Rebecca's expression shifted, becoming almost secretive. "That's where Marcus Ashford lives. Bartholomew's son. He's different from his father." Before Elena could ask what she meant by different, they'd reached the main house's service entrance. Mrs. Hartwell was waiting, along with a dozen other women in various stages of preparation for the evening's work. "Miss Martinez will observe tonight," Mrs. Hartwell announced. "Tomorrow, she'll be assigned permanent duties. Rebecca, you're responsible for showing her proper procedures." The next several hours passed in a blur of activity. Elena watched as the women transformed the main house's dining room into a stage for Ashford's evening entertainment. Crystal glasses were polished to perfection. Silver service was arranged with military precision, and flowers were cut from the garden to create centerpieces that spoke of casual elegance. Ashford emerged from his study just as the preparations were complete, dressed for dinner in a way that emphasized both his wealth and his authority. But Elena noticed something else as she watched him move through his domain. The way the servants shrank slightly when he passed, the careful distance they maintained, the tension that seemed to follow in his wake like a physical presence. This was a man who ruled through fear as much as legal authority, who understood that power was most effective when it was unpredictable and absolute. The dinner service itself was a revelation in the precise choreography of subservience. Each woman knew exactly where to stand, when to move, how to serve without making eye contact or drawing attention to herself. Elena observed the careful balance they maintained, efficient enough to avoid criticism, invisible enough to avoid unwanted notice. But as the evening progressed, she began to notice something else. Not all of Ashford's attention was focused on his meal and correspondence. His gaze frequently wandered to the women serving him, lingering on faces and figures with an assessment that had nothing to do with their professional competence. When his eyes found Elena standing near the sideboard, she felt the full force of his attention like a physical weight. He studied her openly, ignoring the conversation of his dinner guest, a local businessman discussing shipping contracts while he conducted his own private evaluation. "The new girl," he said suddenly, interrupting his guest mid-sentence. "Come, here." Elena felt every eye in the room turn toward her as she stepped forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. Up close, Ashford's pale blue eyes were even more unsettling, cold and calculating, in a way that suggested he saw people as objects to be used rather than individuals deserving of basic human respect. "What's your name again?" he asked, though. Elena was certain he remembered perfectly well. "Elena Martinez, sir. And you can read and write?" "Yes, sir." Ashford smiled, and Elena realized with growing dread that she had just passed some kind of test she hadn't known she was taking. "Excellent. Mrs. Hartwell, I think Miss Martinez would be well suited for house service, personal assistance duties. She can start tomorrow." Elena didn't understand the full implications of personal assistance duties, but she could see from Rebecca's expression that it wasn't good news. As the evening service concluded and the women began clearing the dining room, Elena found herself wondering if she'd just been selected for the exact kind of special attention that Rebecca had warned her about. Later, as she lay in her narrow bed listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into night, Elena stared up at the ceiling and tried to imagine 7 years of this existence. 7 years of walking the knife's edge between competent service and unwanted notice, between survival and something worse than death. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear the faint sound of music, someone playing piano in the main house, the melody drifting across the grounds like a ghost of the life she'd left behind in Virginia. But even as homesickness threatened to overwhelm her, Elena forced herself to remember the promise she'd made on the ship. She would survive this, she would maintain her dignity, and she would find a way back to freedom. What she couldn't know, as exhaustion finally claimed her, was that her salvation was already closer than she dared hope, living in the small house, surrounded by gardens, watching the main house with eyes that saw the same injustices she was only beginning to understand. The Ashford Plantation, April 1858, Elena's first week of personal assistance duties revealed the true meaning behind Ashford's carefully chosen words. Each morning at 5:30, she reported to his private study on the second floor of the main house, where she was expected to organize his correspondence, dust his collection of leather-bound books, and maintain the perfect order he demanded. In his personal sanctuary, but those tasks were merely the acceptable face of her duties. The real expectations began to emerge gradually, like poison seeping through seemingly innocent requests. It started with Ashford asking her to remain after the other servants had been dismissed, ostensibly to help him with important paperwork that required discretion. Then came the casual touches, his hand lingering on her shoulder as she arranged papers on his desk, his fingers brushing hers as she served his afternoon coffee. By the end of her first week, Elena understood with crystal clarity that her position was designed to place her alone with Ashford under circumstances that would make resistance both difficult and dangerous. The man who held her indenture papers was methodically creating opportunities to exploit the power he held over her future. On this particular morning, as spring rain drummed against the study windows, Ashford sat behind his mahogany desk, reviewing shipping manifests while Eleanor dusted the ornate clock on the mantelpiece. The routine had become familiar. She would clean while he worked, both of them maintaining the pretense that her presence served a legitimate household function. "Elena," Ashford said without looking up from his papers, "bring me the ledger from the top shelf behind you." She turned to the bookshelf, reaching up to retrieve the heavy volume. As her fingers closed around the leather binding, she felt Ashford move behind her, his presence suddenly much closer than necessary. When she turned back with the ledger, she found him standing directly in her path, close enough that she could smell the pomade in his hair and see the predatory satisfaction in his pale eyes. "Sir?" she said, clutching the ledger against her. "And just like a shield, "You've been here a week now," Ashford said, his voice carrying the conversational tone of someone discussing the weather. "How are you finding your accommodations, your work assignments?" The question felt like a trap, loaded with implications Elena didn't dare explore. "I'm grateful for the opportunity to work off my father's debt, sir." Ashford smiled, and Elena realized she'd given him exactly the opening he'd been seeking. Grateful. Yes, that's important. Gratitude should be demonstrated, don't you think? Not just spoken. He reached out and touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a possessiveness that made her skin crawl. Elena forced herself to remain still, knowing that any reaction might be interpreted as resistance worthy of punishment. "You're quite beautiful, Elena. Much more so than the usual girls who come to work off family debts. Beauty is valuable here, if a woman knows how to use it properly." Elena understood the implicit bargain being offered. Submit to his advances, and her situation might become more comfortable. Refuse, and face whatever consequences he chose to impose. It was the same choice that had faced countless women before her, the same impossible decision between dignity and survival. "Mr. Ashford," she said carefully, "I'm here to work, to honor my father's debt through honest labor." The word honest hung in the air between them, and Elena saw Ashford's expression shift. His smile remained, but it took on a harder edge, the kind of expression a cat might wear while playing with a mouse. "Honest labor," he repeated. How wonderfully naive. "Tell me, Elena, what do you think happens to servants who prove uncooperative, who fail to appreciate the opportunities their masters provide?" Before Eleanor could respond, a knock at the study door interrupted the increasingly dangerous conversation. Ashford stepped back, his professional mask sliding into place with practiced ease. "Enter," he called. The door opened to reveal a young man Elena had never seen before, though his resemblance to Ashford was unmistakable. He possessed the same strong jaw and aristocratic bearing, but where Ashford's features were sharp and predatory, this man's face held a warmth that spoke of genuine kindness. His dark hair was slightly disheveled, as if he'd been working outdoors, and his clothes, while well made, were practical rather than ostentatious. "Father," the young man said, his gaze taking in the scene with sharp intelligence, "I apologize for interrupting. I wanted to discuss the mill's equipment orders before heading into Charleston." "Marcus," Ashford replied, and Elena realized she was finally meeting the mysterious son Rebecca had mentioned. "I'm busy at the moment. Perhaps we could discuss this later." But Marcus made no move to leave. Instead, his attention turned to Elena, and she found herself subjected to an assessment that felt entirely different from his father's predatory evaluation. Marcus looked at her as if she were a person rather than an object, his expression showing concern rather than calculation. "Miss Martinez, isn't it?" Marcus said, stepping fully into the room. "I heard you joined our household staff. I hope you're finding everything satisfactory." The emphasis he placed on the final word suggested he was asking about more than her general comfort, and Elena sensed an opportunity to extract herself from an increasingly dangerous situation. "Yes, sir," she replied. "Your father was just explaining my duties." "I see," Marcus said, his gaze shifting between Elena and Ashford with obvious understanding. "Father, perhaps Miss Martinez could assist me with some correspondence this afternoon. I have several letters that need transcription, and Mrs. Hartwell mentioned that Miss Martinez has excellent penmanship." Elena held her breath, recognizing that Marcus was offering her an escape from whatever his father had been planning, but she also understood that accepting his intervention might simply transfer her from one form of exploitation to another. Ashford's expression had turned cold. "Miss Martinez's duties are specifically assigned to my personal needs. I'm sure you can find other assistance for your correspondence." Actually, Marcus replied with the casual authority of someone accustomed to getting his way. I've already spoken with Mrs. Hartwell about temporarily reassigning several of the house staff to help with the Charleston office's administrative backlog. Miss Martinez was specifically recommended for her literacy skills. Father and son stared at each other across the study, and Elena realized she was witnessing a power struggle that went far beyond her immediate situation. There was history here. Years of conflict over how the plantation was run and how its workers were treated. Very well, Ashford said finally, his tone suggesting the concession was temporary. But I expect Miss Martinez to return to her regular duties tomorrow morning. Marcus nodded. Of course. Miss Martinez, if you would gather your things. We have quite a bit of work to accomplish. Elena set the ledger on Ashford's desk and followed Marcus from the study, her heart pounding with relief and uncertainty in equal measure. She'd escaped one dangerous situation, but she had no idea what to expect from her unexpected rescuer. Marcus led her downstairs and out of the main house without speaking, his pace brisk and purposeful. They crossed the grounds toward the smaller house Elena had noticed on her first day, the one surrounded by gardens and positioned to overlook both the main house and the mill complex. Mr. Ashford, Elena said as they walked, I want to thank you for— Don't thank me yet, Marcus interrupted, his voice tight with anger that didn't seem directed at her. And please call me Marcus. We have more important things to discuss than formality. His house was smaller than the main residence, but infinitely more comfortable. Where his father's home displayed wealth like a weapon, Marcus's space felt lived in and welcoming. Books were scattered across tables, papers covered his desk in organized chaos, and the windows were open to let in the spring breeze and the sound of birdsong from the garden. Marcus gestured for Elena to take a seat in one of the chairs near his desk, then began pacing the room with the restless energy of someone wrestling with difficult decisions. Miss Martinez, he said finally, I need to ask you some direct questions, and I need honest answers. Can you do that? Elena nodded, though she remained wary. Trust was a luxury she couldn't afford, even when it was offered by someone who seemed genuinely concerned for her welfare. What did my father tell you about your duties here? Specifically, what did he say was expected of you beyond general household work? The question forced Elena to confront the reality she'd been trying to avoid acknowledging. He spoke of demonstrating gratitude, of opportunities that beautiful women could utilize. Marcus stopped pacing and turned to face her directly. And how did you respond to those suggestions? I told him I was here to work honestly, to honor my father's debt through proper labor. A smile flickered across Marcus's features, the first genuine expression of approval Eleanor had seen since arriving at the plantation. Good. That was exactly the right answer, though it probably didn't make him happy. No, sir. It didn't. Marcus sat down across from her, his expression becoming serious again. Elena, may I call you Elena? I need you to understand something. About this place, about my father, and about the situation you're in. Elena nodded, grateful for the opportunity to hear truth rather than carefully worded threats. My father sees the people who work here as property, rather than human beings. The legal structure of indenture gives him tremendous power over the women who end up in his household, and he has particular expectations for those he finds attractive. The confirmation of what Elena had already begun to suspect sent a chill down her spine, and if someone refuses those expectations, punishment, extra work, transfer to mill duty, sometimes worse. Marcus leaned forward, his expression intense. Elena, I want you to know that not everyone here shares my father's perspective. There are people who believe that indenture should involve honest work for honest pay, nothing more. Are you one of those people? Elena asked, studying his face for any sign of deception. I am, and I'm going to help you avoid the fate my father has planned for you if you're willing to trust me." Elena felt a flicker of hope, dangerous and fragile. What kind of help? Marcus stood and moved to his desk, withdrawing a folder of papers. Legitimate work, real correspondence, actual administrative duties. I manage several of the plantation's business operations independently from my father, and I genuinely need someone with good handwriting and organizational skills. He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "But Elena, I need you to understand that accepting my help will likely anger my father. He doesn't like having his plans disrupted, and he especially doesn't like being challenged by his son. Working for me might protect you from one kind of danger while exposing you to another." Elena considered this carefully. She was being offered her choice between certain exploitation by Ashford and uncertain consequences from opposing him. It wasn't much of a choice, but it was more agency than she'd had since leaving Virginia. "What would my duties involve?" she asked. "Correspondence with Charleston merchants, inventory management for the mill operations, maintaining records for the legitimate business activities." Marcus returned to his chair. "Honest work, as you called it. Nothing beyond what any clerk might be expected to do, and you would expect nothing additional?" Marcus looked surprised by the question, then understanding dawned in his eyes. "Elena, I want to help you because what my father does to the women here is wrong. That's the beginning and end of my motivation. I have no interest in exploiting your situation for my own benefit." Something in his tone convinced Elena that he was telling the truth. Perhaps it was the anger she heard when he spoke of his father's treatment of the servants, or perhaps it was simply desperation that made her want to believe him. Either way, she found herself nodding. "I accept your offer, Marcus, and I hope you're as different from your father as you seem to be." "So do I," Marcus replied quietly. "So do I." As Elena spent the afternoon transcribing letters and organizing Marcus's business papers, she felt something she hadn't experienced since leaving Virginia, the possibility that she might survive her indenture with her dignity intact. But she also understood that accepting Marcus's protection had placed her at the center of a family conflict that could have dangerous consequences for everyone involved. Outside the windows, storm clouds were gathering over the South Carolina. Lowland and Elena wondered if the coming tempest would be meteorological or something far more personal and threatening. The Ashford Plantation, May 1858. 3 weeks of working in Marcus's house had transformed Elena's daily existence from a constant state of dread into something approaching normalcy. Each morning, she crossed the gardens that separated his modest home from the main plantation complex, carrying a small basket that contained her lunch and the growing collection of books Marcus had begun lending her. The work was exactly what he'd promised: genuine correspondence, inventory records, and administrative tasks that utilized her education rather than exploiting her vulnerability. But perhaps more importantly, Elena was discovering what it felt like to be treated as a human being rather than property. Marcus proved to be unlike any man she'd ever encountered. Where her father had been weak and her former master predatory, Marcus displayed a quiet strength that manifested itself in unexpected ways. He spoke to her as an equal, asking for her opinions on business matters and actually listening to her responses. When she made suggestions about organizing his filing system or improving his correspondence templates, he implemented her ideas without condescension or surprise. Most remarkably, he seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and experiences beyond their work relationship. During their lunch breaks, as they sat in his garden eating the simple meals she prepared in his kitchen, Marcus would ask about her life in Virginia, her education, her dreams for the future. These conversations felt dangerously intimate, not because of any inappropriate behavior on his part, but because Elena had forgotten what it was like to have someone care about her as a person. On this particular morning, as Elena organized shipping manifests at the small desk Marcus had arranged for her near the window, she found herself stealing glances at him as he worked. He was reviewing mill production reports, his brow furrowed in concentration as he made notes in the margins. Sunlight from the garden window caught the gold highlights in his dark hair, and Elena noticed the way his hands moved with precision and purpose across the papers. The observation startled her with its intimacy. When had she begun noticing such details about her protector? When had Marcus Ashford transformed from a rescuer to something else entirely? "Elena," Marcus said, looking up from his work with a smile that made her heart skip, "I've been thinking about the Charleston office situation. Would you be interested in taking on some additional responsibilities?" Elena set down her pen, grateful for the distraction from her increasingly confusing feelings. "What kind of responsibilities?" "I need someone to handle the correspondence with our textile buyers in Savannah and Richmond. It would mean drafting contracts, managing shipping schedules, essentially serving as my business representative for those accounts." Marcus leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "It's more complex work than what you've been doing, but I think you're capable of handling it." The offer was both flattering and terrifying. Taking on such responsibilities would make her indispensable to Marcus's business operations, which could provide protection from his father's continued interest. But it would also make her defection from Ashford's personal service even more pointed and potentially inflammatory. "Would your father approve of me taking on such important duties?" Elena asked. Marcus's expression darkened slightly. "My father doesn't approve of many things I do, but these are my business operations, funded with my inheritance from my mother's family. He has no legal authority over how I choose to run them." Eleanor heard something in his tone that suggested the distinction between father and son's business interests was more significant than she'd understood. "You operate independently from the plantation?" "As much as possible." Marcus stood and moved to the window, looking out toward the mill complex. "My mother left me a substantial inheritance when she died, along with some property holdings in Charleston. I've been building a textile business that competes directly with my father's operations, though he doesn't know the full extent of it yet." This revelation cast Marcus's intervention in her situation in an entirely new light. He wasn't just protecting her from his father's advances, he was actively working to undermine Ashford's business empire. "Why?" Elena asked. "Why compete with your own father?" Marcus turned back to face her, his expression serious. "Because I've watched him exploit and abuse people my entire life, and I'm tired of being complicit through my silence. The way he treats the servants, the conditions in his mill, the way he acquires his workforce, it's all morally reprehensible." He moved back to his desk, pulling out a folder Elena hadn't seen before. "Do you know how many women like you have come through this plantation over the past 5 years? 43. Young women whose families owed money, who had legal troubles, who had nowhere else to turn. And do you know how many of them completed their full terms of service?" Elena felt her stomach tighten. "How many?" 7. The rest either died from overwork and poor conditions, or they disappeared after refusing my father's advances, sent away to places where they had even less protection than they had here. The numbers hit Elena like physical blows. She had known her situation was dangerous, but she hadn't understood the systematic nature of Ashford's exploitation. She was just the latest in a long line of vulnerable women whose desperation had made them perfect victims. What happened to them? she whispered. Some were sold to brothels in Charleston or Savannah. Others were transferred to plantations where indentured servants are worked to death in the fields. A few simply vanished, and I suspect their fate was worse than either of the other options. Elena sank back in her chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the evil she'd unknowingly entered. "And you couldn't stop any of it?" I tried in small ways. I helped a few women escape, provided them with money and connections to get to safety. But my father grew suspicious, and the consequences for the women I couldn't save became more severe. Marcus's hands clenched into fists. That's when I decided that subtle intervention wasn't enough. I needed to build something that could compete. With his operation directly, offer an alternative to the people he exploits. Elena began to understand the full scope of what Marcus was attempting. He wasn't just running a competing business. He was building a counter-operation designed to undermine his father's ability to exploit vulnerable people. "The textile business you're building," she said slowly, "it employs people fairly? Living wages, reasonable hours, safe working conditions. I hire people who've been mistreated by other employers, especially women who need legitimate work to support themselves or their families." Marcus smiled grimly. "It's not charity. They earn their wages through honest labor. But it's an alternative to the kind of exploitation my father practices." The conversation was interrupted by a commotion. Outside, through the window, Eleanor could see Ashford striding across the grounds toward Marcus's house, his expression thunderous and his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. Behind him, Mrs. Hartwell struggled to keep pace, her usual composure, cracking under whatever crisis had prompted this unexpected visit. "Trouble," Marcus muttered, moving quickly to gather the sensitive documents scattered across his desk. "Elena, I need you to take these papers to the root cellar behind the house. There's a wooden box hidden behind the potato barrels. Put these inside it and don't come back until I call for you." Elena grabbed the folder of documents, her heart racing as she recognized the urgency in Marcus's voice. She slipped out the back door just as Ashford's heavy footsteps reached the front porch, and she could hear his voice raised in anger as he entered his son's house. The root cellar was cool and dark, smelling of earth and stored vegetables. Elena found the hidden box exactly where Marcus had described it, and as she placed the documents inside, she discovered it already contained other papers, what looked like correspondence with Charleston lawyers and business contracts that mentioned something called the Freedom Textile Company. As she crouched in the darkness, Elena could hear the argument raging in the house above. Ashford's voice carried clearly through the wooden floors, his words sharp with fury and accusation. "You think I don't know what you're doing?" Ashford shouted. "Stealing my best servants, interfering with my household management, undermining my authority." Marcus's response was quieter, but Elena could hear the steel in his tone. "I'm running a legitimate business with my own employees. If they happen to be people you've mistreated, that's a reflection of your character, not mine. That girl belongs to me. Her indenture papers give me the right to assign her duties as I see fit. Her indenture papers make her a servant, not a slave. She has the right to honest work and fair treatment, regardless of what you think you're entitled to." The argument continued for nearly an hour, with Ashford's threats becoming increasingly explicit and Marcus's responses growing more defiant. Elena learned that her transfer to Marcus's household had been more controversial than she'd realized, and that Ashford was demanding her immediate return to personal service duties. Finally, she heard footsteps on the front porch and Ashford's voice calling out a final threat. "This isn't over, Marcus. You can't protect her forever, and when you fail, the consequences will be severe for both of you." Elena waited in the root cellar for what felt like hours before Marcus finally called her name. When she emerged, she found him sitting on his front steps, his head in his hands and his usual composure completely shattered. "I'm sorry," he said as she approached. "I'm sorry you had to hear that, and I'm sorry for what it means." Elena sat beside him on the steps, close enough to offer comfort, but careful not to presume too much intimacy. "What does it mean?" "It means my father knows about my business operations, or at least suspects their scope, and it means he's going to escalate his efforts to get you back under his direct control." Marcus looked at her with an expression that combined determination and despair. "Elena, I want you to know that I won't let him hurt you. But I also need you to understand that protecting you might require more drastic measures than I originally planned." "What kind of measures?" Marcus stood and began pacing the garden path, his movements restless and agitated. "I've been building toward this confrontation for years, putting pieces in place for the day when I'd have to choose between my family and my conscience. That day might be coming sooner than I expected." Elena watched him pace, trying to understand the full implications of what he was saying. "Marcus, I don't want to be the reason you destroy your relationship with your father." He stopped pacing and looked at her directly, his expression intense. "Elena, my relationship with my father was destroyed the first time I watched him abuse someone who couldn't fight back. You're not the cause of this conflict. You're just the catalyst that's forcing me to finally take a stand." As evening shadows began to lengthen across the garden, Elena realized that her arrival at the plantation had set in motion events that would reshape the lives of everyone involved. She was no longer just a victim trying to survive her circumstances. She had become the focal point of a moral war between a father who saw people as property and a son who refused to accept that worldview. The question now was whether Marcus's conscience and resources would prove stronger than his father's power and ruthlessness, and whether Elena herself had the courage to stand beside Marcus in whatever battle was coming, knowing that the price of defeat might be worse than anything she'd yet imagined. The Ashford Plantation, June 1858. The retaliation began at dawn, 3 days after the confrontation between father and son. Elena woke to find Mrs. Hartwell standing beside her bed, her face grim with the kind of satisfaction that came from delivering unpleasant news to someone she disliked. "Get dressed," Mrs. Hartwell said without preamble. "Mr. Ashford wants to see you in his study immediately." Rebecca sat up in the adjacent bed, her face pale with understanding. They both knew that a dawn summons to Ashford's private study meant trouble of the worst kind. "What about my duties with Marcus?" Elena asked, pulling on her dress with hands that trembled despite her efforts to appear calm. "Mr. Marcus's business arrangements have been terminated," Mrs. Hartwell replied with obvious pleasure. "You'll be returning to your originally assigned duties, effective immediately." Elena's heart sank as she realized that Ashford had found a way to separate her from Marcus's protection without technically violating any agreements. If he claimed that Marcus's work was no longer necessary, he could reassign Elena to whatever duties he chose. As she followed Mrs. Hartwell across the grounds toward the main house, Elena caught sight of Marcus's cottage. The windows were dark, and she could see no signs of activity. Had something happened to him? Had Ashford found a way to eliminate his son's interference entirely? The main house felt different as they climbed the stairs to Ashford's study. The servants they passed kept their eyes down and moved with the kind of fearful efficiency that suggested recent consequences for anyone who failed to meet expectations. Whatever Ashford had planned, he was ensuring that no one would be willing to help Elena resist it. Ashford was waiting behind his desk when Mrs. Hartwell ushered Elena into the study. He was impeccably dressed as always, but there was something predatory in his posture that reminded Elena of a spider preparing to consume a trapped fly. "Miss Martinez," he said, gesturing to a chair positioned directly in front of his desk. "Please, sit down. We have important matters to discuss." Elena remained standing, some instinct warning her that accepting the chair would place her at a psychological disadvantage. "Where is Marcus?" Ashford smiled, and the expression was all teeth and malice. "My son has been called away on urgent business. A problem with one of his investments in Charleston that required his immediate personal attention. He'll be gone for several weeks, perhaps months." The careful way he said investments suggested that whatever had summoned Marcus to Charleston was engineered by Ashford himself. Elena felt her last source of protection evaporating like morning mist. "Now then," Ashford continued, rising from his chair and moving around the desk to stand closer to Elena. "With that unfortunate distraction removed, we can return to the original arrangement regarding your service here." Eleanor took a step backward, maintaining distance between herself and Ashford's advancing figure. "I understood my duties involved household work and administrative tasks." "Your duties," Ashford said, reaching out to touch her face, "involve whatever I determined they should involve. Your indenture papers give me considerable latitude in how I choose to utilize your time and talents." This time, Eleanor didn't remain passive under his touch. She jerked her head away and stepped back again, her eyes blazing with defiance. "My indenture papers specify honest work in exchange for my father's debt. Nothing more." Ashford's expression shifted, his mask of civilized behavior slipping to reveal the cruel nature beneath. "Miss Martinez, I think you misunderstand your situation here. You are not a guest in my home. You are not an employee with rights and protections. You are property acquired to satisfy a debt, and you will fulfill whatever function I assign. To you." He moved closer again, backing Elena toward the wall. "Now you can make this easy on yourself by accepting the inevitable gracefully, or you can make it difficult and face the consequences. But make no mistake, what happens next is entirely my choice, not yours." Elena felt the wall against her, back, and realized she had nowhere left to retreat. But instead of the paralyzing fear she might have experienced weeks earlier, she felt something else rising within her, a cold, clear anger that burned away her terror and left only determination. "No," she said, her voice steady despite the circumstances. Ashford paused, clearly not expecting such direct refusal. "I beg your pardon?" "I said no. I won't submit to your advances. I won't participate in your twisted idea of gratitude, and I won't be broken by whatever consequences you think you can impose." For a moment, Ashford looked genuinely surprised. Then his expression darkened with rage that transformed his aristocratic features into something genuinely frightening. "You arrogant little fool," he hissed. "Do you have any idea what I can do to you? What I can arrange to happen to you?" "I know exactly what you can do," Elena replied, drawing on reserves of courage she hadn't known she possessed. "But I also know that everything you're threatening to do is wrong, and I won't make it easy for you by pretending otherwise." Ashford's hand shot out to grab her wrist, his fingers closing like a vice around her arm. Eleanor cried out in pain, but she didn't try to pull away. Instead, she met his eyes directly and spoke with all the dignity she could muster. "Go ahead. Hurt me. Assault me. Prove to yourself and everyone in this house that the only way you can have power over a woman is through violence and coercion." Something in her tone seemed to penetrate Ashford's rage. He released her wrist, but didn't step back, his breathing heavy with frustrated anger. "You think your defiance impresses me," he said. "You think standing up to me makes you noble? Let me tell you what it makes you: unemployable, unmarriageable, and completely dependent on whatever mercy I choose to show you." Elena rubbed her wrist where his fingers had left marks, but her voice remained steady. "Then I'll die with my dignity intact. That's more than you can say." The insult struck home with visible impact. Ashford's face flushed dark red, and Elena, could see him struggling to control impulses that would have destroyed any pretense of civilized behavior. "Mill duty," he said finally, his voice tight with barely controlled fury. 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. You want honest work? You'll have more honest work than you can survive. Elena had heard enough about mill conditions to understand that this was effectively a death sentence. The combination of heat, noise, dangerous machinery, and cotton dust would break her body within months. But she also understood that accepting Ashford's original demands would have broken her spirit immediately. "I accept those terms," she said. Ashford stared at her as if she'd spoken in a foreign language. "You accept them?" "I accept honest work under honest terms, even if those terms are designed to punish me for refusing to be your victim." Before Ashford could respond, the study door burst open. Marcus strode into the room, his travel clothes dusty and his expression thunderous with rage. Elena felt her heart leap with relief and something deeper that she didn't dare name. "Get away from her," Marcus said, his voice carrying deadly quiet authority. Ashford turned to face his son, clearly surprised by his sudden appearance. "I thought you were in Charleston dealing with your business crisis." The crisis that never existed. The urgent matter that turned out to be a fabricated emergency designed to get me out of the way. Marcus moved to stand beside Elena, his presence immediately shifting the balance of power in the room. "I spoke with the lawyers you supposedly sent for me. Interesting conversation." Elena could see Ashford calculating, trying to determine how much Marcus had discovered and how it might affect his plans. "Marcus," Ashford said carefully, "this is a private conversation about Miss Martinez's work assignments. It doesn't concern you." "Everything that happens to the people under this roof concerns me," Marcus replied, "especially when it involves my father threatening and assaulting a woman who's under my protection." "Your protection?" Ashford's voice rose. "She's indentured to me. Her protection is my responsibility, and I'll exercise it as I see fit." Marcus stepped forward, placing himself directly between Eleanor and his father. "Actually, no, you won't. Elena, would you please show my father the papers in your dress pocket?" Elena looked at Marcus in confusion. She had no papers in her pocket, and she was certain he knew that. But his expression told her to trust him, so she reached into her pocket and found, to her amazement, a folded document that hadn't been there when she dressed that morning. With trembling fingers, she unfolded the paper and read words that seemed too good to be true. "Certificate of debt satisfaction and release from indenture." "What is this?" Ashford demanded, snatching the paper from Elena's hands. "Exactly what it appears to be," Marcus replied calmly. "A receipt showing that Miguel Martinez's debt has been paid in full, along with Elena's release from her indenture obligations. She's free to leave this plantation whenever she chooses." Ashford scanned the document, his face growing paler with each line he read. "This is impossible. The debt was $300. Where would you get that kind of money?" "From the profits of the business you thought you'd shut down by calling me to Charleston," Marcus smiled grimly. "Did you really think I'd build a competing operation without ensuring I had the resources to protect the people I care about?" Eleanor felt the world spinning around her as the implications of the document sank in. Free. She was actually free, released from the legal obligations that had bound her to this place and these people. "Even if this is legitimate," Ashford said, his voice tight with frustrated rage, "she has nowhere to go. No money, no connections, no prospects. She'll be back here within a week begging for work." Marcus turned to Elena, his expression gentle but serious. "Actually, she has several options. There's a position waiting for her in Charleston with my textile business, a real position with real wages and complete independence. Or if she prefers, I can arrange safe passage to any city where she might want to start over." Elena looked between father and son, hardly daring to believe that her nightmare might actually be ending. I don't understand. How did you manage this? When? I've been working on it since the day we met, Marcus replied. The legal arrangements, the business expansion necessary to generate the funds, the connections to ensure you'd have legitimate opportunities after your release. I just needed time to put all the pieces in place. Ashford crumpled the document in his fist, his composure finally cracking completely. You think this changes anything? You think one woman's freedom matters? In the larger scheme of what happens here, I think it's a beginning, Marcus said quietly, and I think you're about to discover that some changes can't be stopped once they start moving. As Elena stood in Ashford's study, holding the papers that represented her freedom, she realized that her ordeal was finally ending, but she also understood that Marcus had sacrificed something precious to secure her release, his relationship with his father, his position in his family, and probably his inheritance. He had chosen her freedom over his own security, and that choice demanded something from her in return. The question now was what she would do with the liberty he had bought for her, and whether she had the courage to stand beside him as he faced the consequences of defying everything his father represented. The Ashford Plantation, June 1858. The hours following Eleanor's liberation passed in a strange blur of disbelief and overwhelming gratitude. As Bartholomew Ashford stormed from his study, his face twisted with rage and defeat, Eleanor found herself alone with Marcus for the first time since this nightmare had begun to transform into something resembling hope. "Is it real?" she asked, touching the freedom papers with trembling fingers as if they might dissolve at any moment. "Am I truly free to leave?" Marcus nodded, his expression mixing relief with exhaustion. "The debt is satisfied, the legal obligations fulfilled. You can walk out of here right now if you choose to, and no one has any legal claim on your service or your person." Elena sank into the chair she had refused earlier, the weight of sudden freedom almost too overwhelming to process. For months, her entire existence had been defined by her bondage to this place and these people. The idea that she could simply leave felt as foreign as flight. "How?" she whispered. "How did you manage to arrange all this without your father knowing?" Marcus moved to the window, looking out at the plantation grounds with an expression Elena couldn't quite interpret. "I've been planning for this possibility since long before you arrived. My mother's inheritance gave me capital to invest, and I've been building business relationships in Charleston and Savannah that operate completely independently from my father's interests." He turned back to face her, his eyes serious. "Elena, what I told you about helping other women escape, that wasn't entirely accurate. I did help a few individuals, but I also began building something much larger, a network of businesses, boarding, houses, and employment opportunities specifically designed to provide alternatives for women trapped in situations like yours." The scope of what he was describing began to dawn on Elena. "You built an entire system to help women escape indenture, to help them escape all forms of economic bondage, indenture, debt slavery, forced marriages, any situation where women are treated as property rather than people with rights and choices." Marcus's voice carried the passion of someone who'd found his life's purpose. "The textile business I mentioned is just one part of it. There are also educational programs, housing cooperatives, even legal advocacy services." Elena stared at him, trying to reconcile this revelation with everything she thought she knew about her situation. "And my freedom, was that part of some larger plan, or was it personal?" The question hung in the air between them, loaded with implications that went far beyond the legal arrangements surrounding her indenture. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his gaze searching her face as if trying to determine how much truth she was prepared to hear. "It started as part of the larger plan," he said finally. When I first intervened in my father's study that day, I saw you as another victim who deserved help, someone whose situation I could improve through the systems I'd been building. Elena felt something cold settle in her stomach. So her rescue had been nothing more than charity, another case study in his philanthropic project. But, Marcus continued, moving closer to her chair, somewhere along the way it became much more personal than I ever intended it to be. Elena looked up at him, hardly daring to hope she understood what he was trying to tell her. "Eleanor," Marcus said, dropping to one knee beside her chair so they were at eye level, "I need you to know that your freedom isn't conditional on anything. You don't owe me gratitude or loyalty or anything else. You're free to leave here and never see me again, and that's exactly as it should be." "But," Elena prompted, sensing there was more he wanted to say, "but I also need you to know that losing you would break my heart in ways I didn't know were possible." Marcus's voice was barely above a whisper. "I've fallen in love with you, Elena, with your courage, your intelligence, your refusal to let circumstances break your spirit. And if there's any chance that you might feel something similar, I want you to know that building a life together is an option." Elena felt her heart racing as she processed his confession. Love. He was talking about love, not just rescue or protection or charitable assistance. The possibility was both thrilling and terrifying. "Marcus," she said carefully, "how can you be sure what you feel is real? We met under such extreme circumstances, with such an imbalance of power between us. How do we know this isn't just gratitude and relief creating something that feels like love but isn't?" It was an honest question, born from Elena's determination to understand her own feelings as much as his. The weeks they'd spent working together had created an intimacy she'd never experienced with anyone, but she needed to be certain it was based on genuine affection rather than the intense emotions of shared danger. Marcus smiled at her question, and Elena realized it was the first completely unguarded expression she'd seen from him since the confrontation with his father. "Because," he said, reaching out to take her hand, "what I feel for you has nothing to do with rescue or protection or any of the circumstances that brought us together. I love the way you think about problems and find solutions I never would have considered. I love the way you read poetry aloud during our lunch breaks, bringing words to life in ways that make me see them differently. I love watching you work, seeing how your mind organizes complex information into clear, actionable plans." He paused, his thumb tracing gentle circles across her knuckles. "I love your laugh, which I've heard maybe a dozen times, but which sounds like music every single time. I love that you trust me enough to share your thoughts and dreams, even knowing how much power I had over your situation. And I love that you're brave enough to ask whether what we feel is real, because that's exactly the kind of question someone should ask before making important decisions about their future." Elena felt tears gathering in her eyes as she listened to Marcus describe her as if she was someone remarkable rather than someone who'd simply done what was necessary to survive. But beyond the flattery, she recognized the truth in what he was saying. The connection between them had grown from shared work and conversation, from moments of laughter and understanding that had nothing to do with her vulnerable position or his protective role. "I love you too," she said, the words feeling both natural and revolutionary as she spoke them. "I think I started falling in love with you the first day we worked together, when you asked for my opinion about your filing system, and actually listened to my answer. No one had ever treated my thoughts as valuable before." Marcus's smile widened, and Elena saw relief and joy mixing in his expression. "So what happens now? What do you want to do with your freedom?" It was the question Elena had been avoiding since the moment she'd understood she was truly free to leave. What did she want? For so long, her goals had been limited to survival, to enduring whatever came next. The possibility of actually choosing her own path felt almost overwhelming. "I want to be part of what you're building," she said, surprising herself with the certainty in her voice. "Not because I owe you anything, or because I don't have other options, but because I believe in what you're trying to accomplish. I want to help other women find the kind of freedom and dignity that you've helped me discover." Marcus's expression grew serious. "Elena, you need to understand what that would mean. My father won't forgive what happened here today. He'll do everything in his power to destroy my business operations, to discredit the work we're doing, possibly even to hurt the people we're trying to help. Staying with me means accepting those risks." Elena considered this carefully. She was being offered a choice between safety and purpose, between a quiet life somewhere far from these conflicts and an uncertain future dedicated to work that would inevitably make powerful enemies. "Will you be doing this work regardless of whether I stay or go?" she asked. "Yes, I can't stop now, knowing what I know about how many people need help. Then, I want to face those risks beside you, as your partner in the work, and—" Elena felt herself blushing as she spoke the next words, "as your partner in life, if you'll have me." Marcus stood and pulled Elena to her feet, his hands framing her face as he looked into her eyes. "Are you proposing to me, Miss Martinez?" Elena laughed, feeling lighter than she had since leaving Virginia. "I believe I am, Mr. Ashford. Though I should warn you that I come with very little besides the clothes on my back and an unfortunate family history of unpaid debts. And I come with a vengeful father, a dangerous business venture, and a tendency to take on other people's problems, as if they were my own," Marcus replied. "We're quite a pair." Before Elena could respond, Marcus leaned down and kissed her. It was gentle and sweet and full of promise, nothing like the predatory advances she'd feared from his father. This kiss spoke of partnership and respect, of a future built on mutual choice rather than power and exploitation. When they broke apart, Elena rested her forehead against Marcus's chest, breathing in the scent of soap and sunshine that she'd come to associate with safety and home. "What happens next?" she asked. "Next, we leave this place and start building the life we want together. The work is waiting for us in Charleston, and there are women who need our help." Marcus's arms tightened around her. "But first, we need to collect your things and get off this plantation before my father decides to escalate this conflict in ways that could be dangerous for both of us." As they prepared to leave Ashford's study and begin their new life together, Elena realized that her journey from victim to survivor to free woman was complete. But more than that, she had discovered something she'd never expected to find in the midst of her ordeal. A love based on mutual respect and shared purpose, a partnership that transformed both rescue and freedom into something far more powerful than either could have been alone. The girl who had been given to a cruel master as payment for her father's debts was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had chosen her own destiny and found a man willing to stand beside her, as she claimed. Together, they would build something new. A business, a marriage, and a mission dedicated to ensuring that no other woman would face the kinds of choices Eleanor had been forced to make. Freedom, she realized, was not just the absence of bondage. True freedom was the power to choose love over fear, purpose over safety, and hope over resignation. And for the first time in her life, Elena Martinez was truly, completely free. The Ashford Plantation, June 1858. The hour before dawn was the quietest time on the plantation, when even the earliest workers had not yet begun their daily routines. Elena moved through the dormitory building like a ghost, gathering her few possessions and saying silent goodbyes to the women who still slept in their narrow beds, unaware that one of their number was about to escape to freedom. Rebecca stirred as Elena folded her mother's blue dress into the small traveling bag Marcus had provided. In the dim light filtering through the window, Elena could see her roommate's eyes reflecting a mixture of hope and envy that needed no words to communicate. "You're really leaving?" Rebecca whispered, her voice barely audible in the pre-dawn quiet. "I'm really leaving," Elena confirmed, sitting on the edge of Rebecca's bed. "But Rebecca, this isn't the end. Marcus has plans, resources, ways to help other women. Your indenture has only 2 more years. 2 years might as well be 20. Rebecca interrupted gently. "Elena, I'm happy for you, truly, but don't make promises about saving the rest of us. Just live well, live free. That's enough." Elena wanted to argue, to insist that they would find a way to help everyone trapped in this system. But she also understood Rebecca's caution. Hope could be a dangerous luxury for women in their position, and disappointment could be more crushing than despair. "I'll write to you," Elena promised. "When I can." Rebecca smiled sadly. "If letters from you ever arrive, I'll know you really made it out. That's worth more than you know." Elena hugged her roommate goodbye, then slipped out of the dormitory, into the grey morning air. Marcus was waiting for her near the garden gate, dressed for travel and carrying 2 saddled horses. The sight of him filled Elena with a complicated mixture of excitement and terror. Excitement for the future they were about to build together. Terror at leaving behind everything familiar, even if that familiarity had been defined by suffering. "Ready?" Marcus asked, taking her bag and securing it to one of the horses. Elena nodded, though she wasn't sure anyone could ever be truly ready for such a complete transformation of their life. As Marcus helped her mount her horse, she caught a glimpse of movement in the main house. A curtain twitched in what she knew was Ashford's bedroom window, and she realized they were being watched. "He knows we're leaving," she said quietly. Marcus followed her gaze to the window, his expression hardening. "Good. Let him know. Let him understand that some things can't be controlled or owned, no matter how much power he thinks he has." They rode in silence until the plantation was no longer visible behind them, the horses' hooves muffled by the sandy soil of the coastal road. Only when they reached the main Charleston highway did Elena allow herself to believe that her escape was real. The morning sun was rising over the South Carolina landscape, painting the world in shades of gold and possibility that seemed to promise everything she'd never dared to dream. "Tell me about Charleston," Elena said as they settled into a comfortable pace. "About the work we'll be doing." Marcus's expression brightened with enthusiasm as he described the network he'd been building. "The textile business operates out of a converted warehouse near the harbor. We employ about 30 women currently, most of them refugees from situations similar to yours. But it's more than just a business. It's designed to be a complete support system." He explained how the operation included not just employment, but housing assistance, educational opportunities, and legal advocacy. Women who came to work for the Freedom Textile Company found not just jobs, but community and resources to build independent lives. "And the housing?" Elena asked, curious about the practical details of how such a system could work. "Boarding houses scattered throughout the city, all owned or managed by women who understand what it means to need safe shelter. Nothing fancy, but clean and secure, with opportunities for the residents to eventually save enough to establish their own households." Elena found herself impressed by the scope and thoughtfulness of what Marcus had created. This wasn't charity or temporary assistance. It was a systematic approach to helping women achieve genuine independence. "How many women have gone through the program?" she asked. About 200 over the past 3 years. Some stay and become part of the business operations. Others move on to start their own ventures or marry men who treat them as equals rather than property. Marcus smiled. We've had 17 weddings so far, all to men who courted our women properly and earned their genuine affection. The mention of weddings made Elena think about her own future with Marcus. They had confessed their love and spoken of partnership, but the practical details remained undefined. Would they marry immediately or take time to build their relationship on the foundation of shared work? The question felt important, but also premature, given that they were still fleeing the consequences of her liberation. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of hoofbeats approaching rapidly from behind. Elena turned in her saddle to see 3 riders gaining on them, and her heart sank as she recognized the lead figure. Bartholomew Ashford, mounted on his finest horse and flanked by 2 men who looked like hired trouble. "Marcus," Elena said, her voice tight with alarm. He had already seen them. "Hold on," he said, spurring his horse to greater speed. "There's a crossroads about a mile ahead where we can reach help." But Ashford's party was closing the distance quickly, their horses fresher and their riders more experienced with pursuit. Within minutes, they were close enough for Elena to hear Ashford shouting demands for them to stop. "Marcus Ashford!" Bartholomew's voice carried clearly over the thunder of hooves. "You will stop immediately and return my property." The word property sent rage coursing through Elena's veins. Even now, even after the legal documents proving her freedom, Ashford still thought of her as something he owned. The audacity of it strengthened her resolve to escape whatever fate he had planned. Marcus pulled his horse closer to Eleanor's, his expression grim with determination. "When we reach that stand of trees ahead, I want you to turn left onto the side. Road. Follow it for 2 miles until you reach a white house with blue shutters. Tell them Marcus sent you, and they'll hide you until I can deal with this." "I'm not leaving you to face your father alone," Elena replied, having to shout over the wind and hoofbeats. "This isn't a discussion," Marcus said. "Elena, if he catches both of us, I can't protect you. But if you get away, I can handle whatever he does to me." Before Elena could argue further, they reached the trees Marcus had indicated. Without waiting for her agreement, he grabbed her horse's reins and forced both animals onto the narrow side road. The sudden change of direction bought them a few precious seconds as Ashford's party overshot the turn. "Go!" Marcus shouted, releasing her reins and turning his horse back toward the main road. "I'll find you when this is over." Eleanor wanted to stay and fight beside him, but she understood the tactical wisdom of his decision. If they were both captured, Ashford would have won completely. If she escaped, there might still be hope for Marcus and for the larger mission they shared. She spurred her horse toward the White House with blue shutters, praying that Marcus's network was as reliable as he'd claimed. Behind her, she could hear the sounds of confrontation, raised voices, horses circling, the kinds of sounds that suggested negotiation, backed by the threat of violence. The White House appeared exactly as Marcus had described it, surrounded by a well-tended garden and bearing all the signs of prosperous respectability. Elena dismounted and ran to the front door, her heart pounding with fear for Marcus and uncertainty about what kind of reception she would receive. The door opened before she could knock, revealing a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and graying hair pulled back in a practical bun. She took one look at Eleanor's disheveled appearance and obvious distress and stepped aside to let her enter. "Marcus sent me," Elena gasped. "His father is pursuing us. Marcus said you would help." "Of course, dear," the woman replied calmly, as if frightened refugees appeared on her doorstep every day. "I'm Martha Williams. Come inside and let's get you some tea while we wait for news." Mrs. Williams led Elena to a comfortable sitting room and began preparing tea with movements that suggested long practice in providing comfort to people in crisis. Elena found herself in the surreal position of sitting in a stranger's parlor, drinking tea and trying to process the fact that she was now completely dependent on the kindness of people she'd never met. "How many women has Marcus brought here?" Elena asked, needing to understand the scope of the network that was now protecting her. "Oh, dozens over the years," Mrs. Williams replied matter-of-factly. "My late husband and I decided long ago that we couldn't stand by and watch people suffer when we had the means to help. Marcus's work gives us a way to do something meaningful with our resources." Elena was beginning to understand that Marcus had built something far more extensive than she'd realized. Not just businesses and housing, but a community of people committed to helping others escape exploitation. The realization was both comforting and overwhelming. "What if they don't let Marcus go?" Elena asked, voicing the fear that had been growing since they'd separated. "What if his father finds a way to hurt him for helping me?" Mrs. Williams sat down across from Elena, her expression serious but not hopeless. "Marcus is not a helpless young man, dear. He's spent years preparing for this kind of confrontation with his father, and he has resources and allies that Bartholomew Ashford doesn't know about." Before Elena could ask what she meant, they heard horses approaching the house. Elena's heart leapt with fear until she recognized the familiar rhythm of Marcus's horse's gait. She ran to the window and saw him dismounting alone, apparently unharmed, but clearly exhausted from whatever confrontation had taken place. Elena flew out the front door and into Marcus's arms, relief flooding through her as she felt his solid presence and confirmed that he was unhurt. "What happened?" she asked, pulling back to search his face for signs of trauma. Marcus smiled grimly. "My father discovered that threatening a man with legal documents and public witnesses is very different from terrorizing helpless servants in private. When I reminded him that kidnapping is a federal crime and that we had witnesses to his pursuit of us, he decided discretion was the better part of valor." Elena felt a weight lift from her shoulders. "So we're safe, for now. But Elena, we need to be smart about what comes next. My father won't give up easily, and he has resources and connections that could make life difficult for us in Charleston." Mrs. Williams appeared beside them, her practical manner immediately asserting itself. "Well then, we'd better get you two properly married and established before he has time to cause more trouble. I know a minister who asks no questions and keeps excellent records, and Martha Ashford will have much better legal standing than Elena Martinez if your father decides to pursue this matter further." Elena looked at Marcus, suddenly understanding that their romantic future and their practical safety might depend on the same decision. "Is that what you want?" she asked him. "To marry immediately, for protection as much as love?" Marcus took her hands in his expression serious but warm. "Elena, I want to marry you because I love you, and because I want to build a life with you. If marriage also provides legal protection that helps us do the work we're committed to, then that's a blessing rather than a complication." Eleanor considered this, recognizing the wisdom in Mrs. Williams's suggestion, while also acknowledging the romance of the moment. She was being proposed to by a man she loved in the garden of a safe house after escaping from bondage to a future of freedom and purpose. "Yes," she said, surprising herself with how natural the decision felt. "Yes, let's get married. Let's become Mr. and Mrs. Ashford and build something beautiful together." As Marcus kissed her in Mrs. Williams' garden, with the morning sun warming their faces and the promise of freedom stretching ahead of them, Elena realized that her story had transformed from a tale of victimization into something far more powerful. A story of love conquering exploitation, of courage triumphing over cruelty, and of two people choosing to build a life dedicated to helping others find the same freedom they had fought to achieve. Charleston, South Carolina, August 1858. The wedding ceremony took place 3 days later, in Mrs. Williams's parlor, with a handful of witnesses who understood the significance of what they were observing. Elena wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Williams had procured from her own wardrobe, altered to fit Elena's smaller frame. Marcus stood beside her in his best suit, his hand steady and warm, as he placed a simple gold band on her finger. "Do you, Elena Martinez, take Marcus Ashford to be your husband, to love and honor him in prosperity and adversity, in sickness and health, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Elena said, her voice clear and certain despite the overwhelming magnitude of the moment. "Do you, Marcus Ashford, take Elena Martinez to be your wife, to love and protect her, to cherish and respect her as your equal partner, for as long as you both shall live?" "I do," Marcus replied, his eyes never leaving Elena's face. "Then by the power vested in me by the state of South Carolina, I pronounce you husband and wife. Marcus, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle and brief, mindful of their small audience, but Eleanor felt the promise in it, a future built on mutual choice rather than economic necessity, love rather than obligation, partnership rather than ownership. After the ceremony, Marcus and Eleanor took a carriage into Charleston proper, where Eleanor got her first glimpse of the city that would become her new home. The port city bustled with commerce and opportunity, its streets filled with merchants, sailors, and immigrants from a dozen different countries. The diversity was overwhelming after the insular world of the plantation, but it also felt like freedom made visible, a place where people could reinvent themselves and build lives based on their own choices rather than their circumstances of birth. "There," Marcus said, pointing to a 3-story brick building near the harbor. "That's our headquarters." The sign above the entrance read, "Freedom Textile Company," in bold letters, with smaller text below advertising fine fabrics and employment opportunities. Elena could see women moving in and out of the building, some carrying fabric samples, others with the purposeful stride of people heading to work they valued. Inside, the building hummed with productive activity. The main floor housed the textile, operations, looms, cutting tables, and sewing stations, where women worked with obvious skill and concentration. But Elena noticed immediately that this was unlike any mill or factory she'd seen. The workspace was well lit and ventilated, with windows that actually opened and workstations that allowed for conversation and movement. The women looked healthy and alert rather than exhausted and oppressed. "Mrs. Ashford," a young woman approached, them her face bright with genuine pleasure. "We heard about the wedding. Congratulations." Elena felt a small thrill at being addressed by her married name, Mrs. Ashford, Mrs. Elena Ashford. She was no longer Elena Martinez, the indentured servant with no legal rights. She was a married woman with a husband who treated her as an equal and a business that needed her contributions. "Thank you, Sarah," Marcus replied. "Elena, this is Sarah Patterson. She manages our day-to-day operations here and has been essential to everything we've accomplished." Sarah extended her hand to Elena with the confidence of someone accustomed to being treated as a professional equal. "We're so glad you've joined us permanently. Marcus has told us about your organizational skills and business correspondence experience. We could certainly use that expertise." As Marcus showed Elena through the building, she began to understand the full scope of what they'd created. The second floor housed a training program where women learned skills that would allow them to command higher wages, advanced sewing techniques, bookkeeping, even basic literacy for those who'd never had educational opportunities. The third floor contained a small library and meeting rooms where the women gathered for everything from business planning to social events. "This is incredible," Elena said as they concluded the tour. "Marcus, you've built something that goes far beyond just providing jobs. This is a complete community." "It had to be," Marcus replied. Individual charity can help one person at a time, but systematic change requires systematic solutions. We needed to address not just immediate needs, but the underlying factors that make women vulnerable to exploitation in the first place. That afternoon, Elena met with Sarah and several other women who'd become leaders within the organization. She was struck by their diversity, former indentured servants like herself, but also widows who'd been left without resources, immigrants who'd fled desperate situations in Europe, even a few women who'd simply tired of accepting limitations on their ambitions and chosen to build something new. "What we need most," Sarah explained, as they sat around a table covered with ledgers and correspondence, "is someone who can manage our relationships with suppliers and customers in other cities. The business is growing faster than we can handle. With our current administrative structure." Elena studied the papers spread before them, quickly grasping the scope of the challenge. The Freedom Textile Company was successful enough that they were receiving orders from merchants as far away as New York and Boston, but they lacked the organizational framework to manage such extensive operations efficiently. "What if we established regional representatives?" Eleanor suggested. "Women who could handle orders and communication in their own cities rather than trying to manage everything from Charleston." The idea sparked immediate interest around the table. Marcus leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "That would require training people we trust and providing them with startup capital to establish their own operations. It would also mean spreading our model to other cities," Elena continued, her excitement building as she thought through the possibilities. "Instead of just helping individual women, we could be creating opportunities for women to build businesses that help other women." Sarah smiled broadly. "I like how she thinks, Marcus. Are you sure you want to share her with the rest of us?" Elena felt a warm flush of satisfaction. For the first time since leaving Virginia, she was being valued for her mind and her contributions, rather than pitied for her circumstances or desired for her appearance. These women saw her as a colleague and collaborator, someone whose ideas had merit, independent of her relationship to Marcus. Over the following weeks, Eleanor threw herself into the work with an enthusiasm that surprised even her. She developed correspondence systems that streamlined their order management, created training materials for potential regional representatives, and began building relationships with suppliers who shared their values about fair labor practices. But perhaps most importantly, she began working directly with newly arrived women who needed the same kind of support she'd received months earlier. Elena discovered she had a talent for helping frightened, traumatized women understand their options and begin building confidence in their own abilities. "The key," she told Marcus one evening as they reviewed the day's work in their small apartment, above a bookstore, is helping them understand that they're not damaged goods because of what they've survived. Their experiences give them strength and wisdom that can benefit other people." Marcus looked up from the correspondence he was reviewing, his expression admiring. "You've found your calling, haven't you?" Elena considered this. "I think I have. For so long, I thought my goal was just to survive, to endure whatever circumstances I found myself in. But now I understand that survival isn't enough. I want to help other women do more than just survive. I want to help them thrive." Their conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Elena opened it to find a young woman she didn't recognize, clearly distressed and carrying a small bundle that suggested hasty departure from wherever she'd come from. "Please," the woman said, "I was told that Marcus Ashford helps women who need to escape. Is this the right place?" Elena stepped aside to let the woman enter, recognizing the desperation and hope that had driven her to seek them out. "Yes, this is the right place. You're safe now. What's your name?" "Catherine Brooks," the woman replied, tears streaming down her face. I was indentured to a family in Savannah, but the master's son, he wouldn't take no for an answer. When I fought him off, they said I was violent and uncontrollable. They were going to sell my indenture to a plantation where they said the work would calm my temperament. Elena felt a cold fury at the familiar story, but she kept her voice calm and reassuring. Catherine, you did the right thing by coming here, and you did the right thing by fighting off anyone who tried to hurt you. There's nothing wrong with defending yourself. As Elena helped Catherine get settled and explained the resources available to her, she realized how far she'd traveled from the frightened woman who'd arrived at the Ashford plantation just months earlier. Now, she was the one offering safety and hope to someone else in desperate need. Marcus joined them, bringing tea and the kind of gentle authority that helped traumatized women begin to trust again. Elena watched him interact with Catherine and marveled at how naturally he assumed the role of protector without ever being condescending or patronizing. Tomorrow, Marcus told Catherine, we'll get you registered for our training program and help you find safe housing. But tonight, you can stay in our guest room and just rest. You're safe here, and no one will hurt you. After Catherine had been settled for the night, Eleanor and Marcus sat together in their small parlor, processing the day's events and planning for tomorrow's challenges. Do you ever wonder, Eleanor asked, if we're really making a difference? We help individual women, but there are so many others still trapped in situations like the ones we escaped from. Marcus took her hand, his thumb tracing the simple wedding band that had become a symbol of so much more than their marriage. I think about it every day. But Elena, look at what we've accomplished just in the past few months. Catherine found us because women in Savannah knew we existed. Our regional representatives are helping women in 3 different cities now. Sarah told me yesterday that 5 of our former trainees have started their own businesses. Elena nodded, recognizing the truth in what he was saying. So we're not just helping individuals, we're building a network that helps more people than we could ever reach directly. Exactly. And every woman who finds her freedom and builds a successful life becomes someone who can help others do the same. The impact multiplies. As Elena prepared for bed that night, she reflected on how completely her life had been transformed. 6 months ago, she'd been property, owned by a cruel master who saw her as nothing more than an object for his gratification. Tonight, she was a wife, a business partner, and a woman whose work was making a tangible difference in other people's lives. The girl who'd been given as payment for her father's debts was gone forever. In her place was a woman who understood that true freedom meant not just escaping oppression, but building something that prevented others from experiencing it in the first place. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new women who needed help, new opportunities to expand their network of support and opportunity. Elena looked forward to it all with the confidence of someone who had discovered her purpose and the strength to pursue it, no matter what obstacles might arise. Charleston, South Carolina, December 1862, and a half years had passed since Elena's escape from the Ashford plantation, and the world around Charleston was changing with the rapid pace of a nation hurtling towards civil war. But within the walls of the Freedom Textile Company, a different kind of revolution had been quietly taking place, one measured not in political declarations, but in the transformed lives of hundreds of women who had found dignity, purpose, and independence through honest work. Elena stood at the window of their expanded headquarters, now occupying an entire city block, watching snow fall on Charleston's cobblestone streets. At 22, she had evolved into someone she could never have imagined during those desperate days of her indenture. Her hair was styled in the confident manner of a successful businesswoman. Her dress was well made but practical, and her bearing reflected the quiet authority of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected many lives. "Mrs. Ashford," came a voice behind her, "the Richmond representative is here for the quarterly meeting." Elena turned to see Mary Sullivan, the young woman who had become her personal assistant and was being trained to eventually manage one of their satellite operations. Mary had arrived 6 months earlier, fleeing an arranged marriage to a man 3 times her age, who had already buried 2 wives under suspicious circumstances. "Thank you, Mary. Please show her to the conference room and let the others know we'll begin in 10 minutes. As Mary hurried away, Elena reflected on how natural it had become to be addressed with respect, consulted for important decisions, and trusted with significant responsibilities. The frightened girl, who had once scrubbed floors and feared every footstep in the hallway, was now someone who employed over 200 women across 7 cities and had become a respected voice in Charleston's business community. The conference room was filled with the women who had become Elena's closest collaborators and dearest friends. Sarah Patterson was there, now managing their largest textile operation in Savannah. Rebecca Stone had joined them 8 months earlier when her indenture finally ended, and had proven to have remarkable talents for financial management. Catherine Brooks, the young woman who had arrived at their door that first night, was now their most successful regional representative, managing operations in Richmond that had helped over 50 women establish independent lives. But perhaps most remarkably, the meeting also included 3 women whose stories would have been impossible to imagine when Eleanor first conceived of their expansion plans. Amanda Foster had been rescued from a brothel in New Orleans and now ran a boarding house that specialized in helping women transition from lives of forced prostitution to legitimate employment. Margaret O'Brien had fled the Irish potato famine only to find herself trapped in domestic servitude in Boston, and now managed a textile operation that employed dozens of Irish immigrant women. Lucy Chen had escaped from forced labor in the California gold mines and established a West Coast network that helped Asian women who faced particular challenges due to racial prejudice. "Ladies," Eleanor began, taking her place at the head of the table, "I want to start this meeting by acknowledging what we've accomplished together. When Marcus and I first began expanding beyond Charleston, we hoped we might help a few dozen women in other cities. Today, we're going to review reports that show we've directly assisted over 800 women in the past 2 years, and indirectly affected the lives of thousands more." The women around the table exchanged smiles of satisfaction and pride. These were not charity cases or grateful recipients of handouts. These were business partners who had built something unprecedented in American commerce. "But," Elena continued, "we're also meeting at a time when our work is becoming more important and more dangerous than ever before. The political situation is deteriorating rapidly, and there's increasing talk of war between the states. We need to discuss how to protect our operations and the women who depend on us during what may be very difficult times ahead." Sarah leaned forward, her expression serious. "We've already seen increased hostility in Savannah. Some of the local businessmen are claiming that our employment of women is taking jobs away from men who need to support families. There's been talk of legislation to restrict women's participation in textile work." Rebecca added her own concerns. "The banks in Charleston are becoming more conservative about lending to businesses owned by women. They're saying the political uncertainty makes such investments too risky." Elena listened to each woman's report, noting the patterns of increasing resistance to their success. It seemed that as their network had grown more visible and influential, they had also attracted the attention of people who saw independent women as a threat to the established social order. "There's something else we need to discuss," Elena said, opening a folder that contained correspondence she'd been reluctant to share. "I've been receiving letters from Bartholomew Ashford." The room fell silent. Everyone knew the story of Elena's escape and the ongoing tensions with Marcus's father, but Ashford had remained a distant threat rather than an immediate problem. "What kind of letters?" Catherine asked, her voice tight with concern. "Legal threats, mostly. He's claiming that our employment practices violate various state laws, that we're operating as an illegal conspiracy to deprive men of their rightful authority over their wives and daughters." Elena set down the letters with visible distaste. "But more concerning are the reports I'm receiving from our contacts in rural areas. Ashford has been buying up indenture contracts from other plantations and mill owners, apparently trying to corner the market on vulnerable women." The implications were chilling. If Ashford could control enough indenture contracts, he could effectively cut off the supply of women seeking alternatives to exploitative situations. "He's trying to strangle a recruitment at the source," Mary observed, her quick mind grasping the strategy immediately. "Exactly, and there's more." Elena hesitated, then continued. "I've also learned that he's been corresponding with plantation owners and factory managers in other states, sharing information about our operations and encouraging them to take legal action against our regional representatives." Margaret O'Brien spoke up, her Irish accent still strong despite years in America. "So what do we do? Do we fight back, or do we try to avoid the confrontation?" Elena looked around the table at these remarkable women who had become her family, her partners, and her inspiration. Each of them had faced impossible choices and found the courage to choose freedom over security, dignity over survival. The question Margaret had posed wasn't really about business strategy. It was about whether they would allow fear to diminish what they had built together. "We fight," Eleanor said firmly, "but we fight smart. We document everything we do, ensure that all our operations are absolutely legal and above reproach. We build alliances with sympathetic lawyers, ministers, and businessmen who support what we're doing. And we make sure that every woman we help understands that she's not just receiving assistance, she's becoming part of a movement that's bigger than any individual story." The meeting continued for 3 more hours as they developed comprehensive plans for protecting their operations, expanding their legal defenses, and creating contingency plans for the increasingly uncertain political climate. But as the other women prepared to return to their respective cities, Elena asked Rebecca and Catherine to remain behind. "There's something else," Elena said once they were alone. "Marcus and I have been discussing the possibility of establishing operations in Canada and England. If war comes, and if the legal environment here becomes too hostile, we may need to relocate entirely." Rebecca looked shocked. "Leave Charleston? Leave everything we've built here?" "Not abandon it," Elena clarified, "but create alternatives, safe havens where women can find the same opportunities and support, regardless of what happens to our American operations." Catherine nodded slowly. "It makes sense. And honestly, the idea of helping establish something in a completely new place sounds like an incredible opportunity." As evening fell and the last of the visitors departed, Elena found herself alone in the office that had become the nerve center of everything she cared about most in the world. Marcus would be home soon from his own meetings with Charleston's business leaders, and they would spend the evening planning their next moves in the ongoing chess game with his father. Elena walked through the building one more time before locking up, taking note of the looms that would resume their productive rhythm tomorrow morning, the training classrooms where women would learn skills that could support them for a lifetime, the library where others would discover that education was a form of freedom no one could take away from them. At her desk, she opened the bottom drawer and withdrew a letter that had arrived that morning. It was from Virginia, from Miguel Martinez, her father. The handwriting was shaky, suggesting that his drinking had progressed to the point where it affected his motor control, but the words were clear enough. My dear Elena, I heard from neighbors that you have married well and built a successful business. In Charleston, I want you to know how proud I am of what you have accomplished and how deeply I regret the circumstances that led to your departure from Virginia. I know that I failed you as a father, that my weaknesses cost you your freedom, and nearly cost you much more. I cannot undo what I did, but I want you to know that not a day passes that I don't think about your courage and strength. I am dying, Elena. The doctor says I have perhaps months left, and I wanted to write while I still could. I don't expect forgiveness, and I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that the last debt I will ever incur is the one I owe to you, for surviving what I put you through, for building something beautiful from something terrible, and for proving that my failures did not define your future. Live. Well, my daughter, live free. Your father, Miguel Martinez, Elena, set the letter down with tears in her eyes, but they were not tears of sadness or anger. They were tears of completion, of a circle finally closed. The frightened girl who had been given as payment for her father's debts had evolved into a woman who could receive such a letter with compassion rather than bitterness. Marcus found her there an hour later, still sitting with the letter in her. "Hans, bad news?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her desk. "No," Elena said, managing a smile. "Actually, I think it might be good news, or at least necessary news." She handed him the letter and watched his expression as he read. Marcus had never met her father, but he understood the significance of Miguel's words, the importance of acknowledgement and closure. "Will you write back?" Marcus asked. Elena considered this. "Yes, I think I will. Not to offer forgiveness, that's not mine to give, but to let him know that I'm happy, that I'm building something meaningful, and that his mistakes don't define either of us anymore." Marcus took her hand, the simple gold band catching the lamplight. "I love you, Elena Ashford. I love your strength, your compassion, your refusal to let bitterness poison what we're building together." Elena stood and moved to the window, looking out at Charleston's gaslit streets and thinking about all the women who were sleeping safely tonight because of the work they had done together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new women who needed help, new opportunities to expand their network of freedom and dignity. "Do you know what I have realized?" she said, turning back to Marcus. "When I first escaped from your father's plantation, I thought freedom meant being left alone, being safe from people who wanted to hurt me. But real freedom is much bigger than that." "What is it then?" Marcus asked. Elena smiled, thinking of all the women whose lives had been transformed, all the children who would grow up with mothers who understood their own worth, all the future generations who would benefit from the choices they were making today. Real freedom is the power to help other people find their own freedom. It's building something that outlasts your own life, something that makes the world a little more just and a little more kind than it was when you found it. As they prepared to leave the office and return to their small apartment, Elena took one last look around the room where so many important decisions had been made, so many lives had been changed, so many women had discovered that they were worth more than the worst things that had happened to them. The girl who had been given to a cruel master as payment for a debt was gone forever. In her place stood a woman who had learned that love could conquer cruelty, that courage could triumph over exploitation, and that the best revenge against those who tried to diminish your humanity was to use your freedom to lift others up. Elena Ashford locked the door behind them and walked hand in hand with her husband through the Charleston night, ready to face whatever tomorrow might bring, secure in the knowledge that some things, love, dignity, and the determination to help others, could never be bought, sold, or taken away by anyone, no matter how much power they thought they possessed. The legacy of her suffering had become a legacy of freedom, and that, Elena knew, was a story worth living, Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.